Hey there, in this video I'll be doing a deep dive into the R7 versus the R5 for shooting video. And you might be asking yourself, Josh, why are you doing this? The R7 goes for $1,500, the R5 goes for $3,900. How are these comparable? Well, in my experience, they're actually very similar. And as you've been watching this, and I've been switching back and forth between the two cameras, because I'm shooting on both of those right now, can you tell the difference between the R7 and the R5? How about if I put them next to each other? Can you tell the difference between the two of them? Did you get it right? All right, let's get into all the details here. As you saw outside, the image quality of these two cameras are pretty close, and so I wanted to start off this video by talking about image quality because that really is one of the most important things about any camera. So I want to give you a few more examples here so you can take a look and compare them. I'll show you a comparison and then you can guess which one's which, so take a look. After looking at those examples, I really do believe that the image quality is very, very similar between these two cameras. I know there's a slight difference in color, and I tried to make them match as best as possible, but that's because they have different sensors. The image quality really comes down to the fact that these are both oversampled cameras, and those examples were shot in C-Log 3 and 4K fine. So in the R7, that's a 7K oversample to 4K, and the R5 is an 8K oversample to 4K. Just produces an amazingly detailed and sharp image, and I think the R7 is definitely on par with the R5, and I'd really have trouble telling the difference between the two of them. So now let's take a look at autofocus. From looking at that comparison and also from my own personal previous use, I can conclude that the autofocus is pretty similar between them. They both work awesome, as you'd expect from a modern Canon mirrorless camera. So next, let's talk about dynamic range. And I did make a video comparing the dynamic range of the R7 with the R5 and the C70, which I'll leave a link down below. I have to say that the dynamic range is very similar between these two cameras in C-Log 3, probably around 12 or just over 12 stops. And next thing is about overheating. And so for overheating, I did a bunch of tests in previous videos, and I'll link everything I can think of, as I said, down below if you want to check out these videos. Now the R7, when I ran it inside in 4K fine and 24 frames a second, it ran until the battery ran out at 2 hours and 14 minutes. So no overheating there. And then the R5 undid the same thing. Same thing happened, ran out after an hour and 40 minutes. Again, this is after the new 1.6.0 update, which they've essentially eliminated the overheating issue in the R5. But one thing you can see there was it ran a little bit less, so the R5 definitely uses a little bit more power. When I brought the cameras outside, I did two tests. They were on different days, but the conditions were very similar. It was pretty warm. It was probably 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had them in the sun. And so the R7 ran for an hour and 1 minute before it shut down. The R5 ran for an hour and 34 minutes until it shut down. Basically, until the battery died, it was like only a few minutes left on the battery. And so those were stress tests. Again, I wouldn't just run the camera outside in the heat in the sun, but those are both all those tests were in 4K fine. So the R5, to me, from my tests, runs a little bit longer before overheating than the R7. But the R7 also has that really nice meter on it where it kind of warns you as you're stepping up versus this just sort of flashing light on the R5. So again, overheating is not as much of an issue with these cameras. And if you're using them in a more controlled environment, or you're just using them on and off or not in full sun, I really don't think it's much of an issue between these two cameras. Now let's kind of talk about some of the differences between these two cameras in terms of how they record video. First of all, the R5, as you probably know, is a full frame camera. The R7 is an APS-C camera with a 1.6 times crop. In addition to that, there's something that really bothers me about the R5, and that is the 30-minute record limit is still in place on this camera. So you can't record past 29 minutes and 59 seconds without restarting the camera. The R7 does not have that limit, so that is a big difference for a lot of people in terms of video recording. The R5 also has DCI, whereas the R7 does not. It only has UHD. So let's get into talking about some of the codecs and things like that. They both shoot in 4K, 10-bit 422 H.265, and they both shoot in C-Log3, so you get a good amount of dynamic range, which I already talked about. A big difference in terms of codecs. Now, the R7 only shoots in IPB and IPB Lite. The R5 will shoot in IPB All-I and RAW in 8K, not RAW in 4K, but you get All-I and IPB and all of that stuff. So for me personally, I shoot most of my work with IPB codecs because they're smaller and my computer can handle it. But if you're shooting a lot of fast-moving subjects, a lot of motion in the frames that you're recording, All-I is better. It's also easier on your computer. But you'll know if you need All-I or if you can get away with IPB. For talking head stuff or stuff that doesn't have a ton of motion, IPB is more than fine. On my C70, I'm often shooting in long-op, which is an IPB compression. Let's get on talking about frame rates now. So the big difference here is the R5 can shoot up to 4K 120 and can also shoot in 8K up to 30 frames a second. Now, there's some differences in the slow motion stuff and the frame rates. So most people know that, the R7 will shoot up to 4K 60, but 4K 60 has some limitations. You can either get a line skip 4K 60 or a 1:1 readout with an additional 1.8 times crop on top of the 1.6 crop. So a little bit limiting in 4K 60. Again, that 4K 60 is line skipped, but I did make a video about all the recording modes in this camera, link down below. Now the R5 can shoot up to 4K 120, but 4K 60 and 4K 120 are line skipped. They're not part of that 4K fine or 4K HQ oversample. So the quality is not quite as good as you get in 24 or 30 frames a second. There's a little bit of a workaround. If you shoot in the APS-C crop mode on this camera, which is a still 5.1K oversample, so it's not line skipped, it's actually an oversampling, you can shoot up to 4K 60 and you get that nice oversampled image. You don't have that line skip. So you do have that option. If you don't want to line skip 460, you can do it in crop mode on this camera, and it's only a 1.6 times crop versus on this camera, if you do it with the crop mode, it's a lot more. It's 1.6 times 1.8-ish. I forget the exact number. So that's kind of a big difference. If you're looking to shoot 4K 60 or 4K 120, you have to keep that in mind in terms of lens choices and those sorts of things. I know for a lot of people that shoot high frame rates in 4K, the R7 is a little bit limiting, so you want to keep that in mind. Also 8K, if you want to get into 8K, this camera can shoot 24 and 30 frames a second in 8K, either in a compressed codec and also in RAW. So a lot more options with the R5, and I just wanted to highlight the differences there because for most people, if you're shooting in 24 or 30 frames a second for a lot of simple things, the R7 can cut it, but if you need a lot more advanced features, the R5 has them. Now let's go on talking about low light. And I know a lot of you are probably interested in this because usually when you think, okay, crop sensor camera versus full frame camera, the crop sensor camera is gonna be limited in terms of low light. But nowadays with oversampling and some careful noise reduction in these cameras, the crop sensor cameras are doing a lot better. So let's do a comparison here. I've done a lot of comparisons with the R7 and other cameras. So I did compare directly the R7 and the R5 here. So one thing you want to keep in mind that the R5 has a dual base ISO of 800 and 3200, and the R7 only has a base ISO of 800. This is all shot in C-Log3. The R7 definitely hung in there and I think has very strong low light performance for a crop sensor camera. Now, keeping in mind that the R5 has that dual base ISO of 800 and 3200, it really does clean up, going from 2500 to 3200. And the R5 is definitely in the lead, but only slightly as it goes through the ISO range. But I would say that the R7 is good up to 6400, and you could push it to 8000 or 10,000 if you really needed to. Overall, very strong performance from the R7. Let's talk a little bit about the physical design of these two cameras, and both of them feel great when you hold them. They feel like a classic Canon camera, nice big grip. The texture feels nice. I really do like the fact that the R7 is pretty big, even considering that it is an APS-C camera. The R5 is just a little bit bigger, and I think does feel a little bit better. I like a slightly larger camera when you're holding it. In terms of the layout, there's definitely differences with the buttons and stuff, but in general, they both do the same thing. There's one difference I do want to point out is that the R7 only has 2 control dials for controlling exposure, so you're gonna leave one out. So like on the R5, I would use the front one for shutter, the top one for aperture, and the wheel in the back for ISO. This would be for aperture, and this would be for shutter. And if you wanna change the ISO on the R7, you press the ISO button and then you have to make the adjustment. So again, it's frustrating for me, and especially if you're doing photography, to just quickly be able to change all those things. For me personally, I'm not changing the ISO very much. It's generally living at the base ISO. But again, that's something that I wish was different on this. And some people were critical about this new design with this wheel around the control button here too, but I don't really mind it so much. Now, in terms of ports, very, very similar. The only difference is you have a flash sync port on the R5 and a remote port, but otherwise you still have a mic and headphone jack, HDMI, of course, micro, which is, don't even get me started on that, and a USB port. On the back, there's a slight difference in the screens. So the R5 has a slightly larger screen. It's a 3.2 inch, 2.1 million dot, and the R7 has a 3-inch 1.62 million dot. So the R5 has a slightly nicer screen. In terms of batteries, they both use the LPE6NH batteries. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the battery lasts a little bit longer on the R7, as you'd expect, but both have great battery life. In terms of media, we're gonna get 2 SD cards on the R7, which I actually really like having 2 of the same, because if you're doing dual recording and you don't have to manage 2 different kinds of media. Also, a lot of cameras use SD cards, so that's great. On the R5, we have mixed media, which is an SD card and a CF Express Type B card. And you do need the CF Express Type B card for some of the higher frame rates and codecs and stuff like that. There was a time where the CF cards were a lot more expensive, but Angelbird has a very affordable one, which I'll leave linked down below, which does work pretty well. So if you want to access those higher frame rates, codecs, those sorts of things, you will need that card. But it is a little bit faster too, which is nice. But overall, great design in terms of the layout of these cameras. I think they both feel great, and they're fun to use, and everything's very accessible. One thing that gets overlooked a lot with full frame cameras is the ability to use crop mode. So for example, on the Sony a7S III or the FX3 or the FX6, you can't just punch in 4K because there's not enough megapixels, but having that ability in the R5 is awesome to be able to punch in. It really gives you a lot more range on different lenses, so keep that in mind. You can also put crop sensor lenses on the R5 and use it in crop mode too, so a lot more flexibility with that versus the R7. You've got to put crop sensor lenses on this. Of course, you could put full frame lenses on this too, but you're only going to be looking at the middle part of the image. So that leads me on to talking about lenses. And I think this is where my biggest issue is with the R7 in general, is the fact that we don't have a lot of lenses for the R7. Now, of course, you can put full frame lenses on the crop sensor camera, like I mentioned, but there's only 2, as of right now, RFS, which are crop sensor RF lenses for this camera, and they're both kit lenses. They're not super exciting. I do have one. I am not super impressed by it, and I'm often using my my larger RF zooms, like I have the 15-35 and the 24-70, which seems a little bit overkill for this and doesn't really match the camera that well. I really do hope that there are more options coming out that are native to this camera in terms of crop lenses, especially wide angle ones. I always feel like there's not enough wide angle options because they have to be even wider because of the crop. So again, you can do things like this. Like I made a video about putting a speed booster on this camera using full frame EF lenses, another great option. And there's a lot of workarounds with this. A great lens for this is also the Sigma 18-35, which I made a video about as well. So there are options on here, but I really do think that for the crop sensor world to work for Canon, they need to put out more lenses. And, you know, obviously you have all the full frame RF lenses and the EF full frame lenses that you can use on this camera and adapt it to. So again, for when you're shooting on APS-C, I really do wish it was smaller and lighter and sort of take the benefit of that smaller sensor. And I'm often using full frame lenses on this camera. So that's a little bit of a difference. Now let's go on talking about price. And that's where it gets really interesting, because the R5 is selling for $3,900 at the time of recording this. It's just the same price that it launched at 2 years ago. The R7 sells for $1,500. So you can get two R7s for less than the price of an R5. So this is where you really have to start thinking about the things that you actually need in a camera. Of course, all of us would want all the specs and the biggest sensor and all that stuff whenever possible, but there's a lot of other things to consider. So again, if you need 4K 120, not nice to have, but if you need it, then you need it. If you need 8K, then you need the R5. But if you are using 4K 60 occasionally, maybe you can use 1080p 120. You really sort of have to think about the difference between these two cameras. As I said, the codecs are different between having all-I and RAW and 8K, having DCI. Those are the big differences, I think, with the R5. But if you are doing YouTube, or you are just getting into videography, or doing some home video, or maybe using this as a B cam to some larger cameras. I compared this against the R5C and against the C70. So there's a lot of potential with the R7, and I think bang for the buck, it is awesome. Also, if you are putting crop sensor lenses on this camera, they are going to be a little bit cheaper than full frame lenses. So overall, the package gets a lot cheaper. So really ask yourself what you need. I think for me personally, I am often shooting in 24 frames a second, and I'm not using slow motion and higher frame rates very often. The R7 does work really well for a lot of situations, and I really wanted to bring this to everyone's attention, because if you're just getting into videography or looking for an extra body, the R7 is a great option. So if you're interested in picking up either of these cameras, there are affiliate links down below. I would really appreciate if you check them out for both these cameras and also all the gear that I use on a regular basis. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.